They called him the Milwaukee Cannibal, a quiet man living in a small apartment that hid one of the darkest secrets America had ever seen. For years, Jeffrey Dahmer blended into his neighborhood, polite to some, strange to others, but never suspected of the horrors lurking just beyond his locked door. When police finally entered his apartment in July 1991, what they found was beyond imagination. Inside the freezer sat a human head. A barrel filled with acid contained dissolving torsos. And tucked away in a drawer, police discovered dozens of Polaroid photographs, each one documenting the gruesome stages of death and dismemberment. These pictures became some of the most chilling evidence ever presented in an American courtroom. This is not just the story of Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes. It's the story of the victims who never made it out, the families who fought for justice, and the system that failed to stop him. Stay with us as we dive into the full case, piece by piece. And if you want more deep true crime stories like this one, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born in May 1960 in West Allis, Wisconsin. To his neighbors, he was just another awkward boy in the suburbs. A child with big glasses, a strange stare, and a silence that could fill a room. His father was a chemist, his mother often ill. Their home life was fragile, fractured, and filled with arguments. Even as a young boy, Dahmer showed signs that something wasn't right. He developed a fascination with dead animals. Roadkill, carcasses, bones, he collected them, dissected them, stored them in jars. Neighbors thought he was just odd, but inside his mind, death was already becoming an obsession. By high school, Dahmer had become a loner. He was known for pranks, bizarre antics, and for showing up to class drunk. He was isolated, misunderstood, and largely ignored. But under that strange, quiet exterior, dark urges were growing. In June 1978, just 3 weeks after graduating from high school, Dahmer acted on those urges for the first time. His parents' marriage had collapsed, his mother had left home with his younger brother, and Jeffrey was alone in the family house. That summer, he picked up a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks, an 18-year-old heading to a rock concert. Dahmer lured him in with the promise of beer and company. They drank, they talked, but when Hicks said he wanted to leave, Dahmer panicked. He struck him with a dumbbell, strangled him, and later dismembered the body. He buried the remains in the woods behind his house. It was the first murder, but not the last. For nearly 9 years afterward, Dahmer did not kill again. He joined the army but was discharged for alcohol abuse. He lived in Florida briefly, then returned to Ohio. He drifted job to job, often drunk, always struggling to fit in. He was arrested for sexual misconduct, public drunkenness, and indecent exposure. There were signs, plenty of them, but no one connected the pieces. By the late 1980s, Dahmer was living in Milwaukee. He worked at a chocolate factory, lived in small apartments, and haunted the city's gay bars. There, he found his victims. Young men, many of them Black or Asian, many of them marginalized or estranged from their families. Dahmer lured them with promises of money, alcohol, or photos. Once inside his apartment, the trap was sprung. He drugged them, strangled them, and kept their bodies close. He photographed them, dismembered them, and stored body parts in his refrigerator and freezer. Some skulls he kept as trophies. Some flesh he attempted to eat. Between 1987 and 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer killed at least 16 more men. His neighbors sometimes complained about foul smells coming from his apartment. He made excuses, spoiled meat, plumbing issues. No one suspected the truth. There were moments when he might have been stopped. In May 1991, a 14-year-old boy named Conorak Synthesomphone escaped Dahmer's apartment, drugged and bleeding. Neighbors called police. Officers arrived, but Dahmer convinced them it was a lover's quarrel. The boy was returned to Dahmer's care. Hours later, he was dead. By July 1991, Dahmer's world was spiraling out of control. He killed more frequently, and his apartment had become a literal chamber of horrors. Skulls in a filing cabinet, a barrel of acid filled with dissolving torsos, Polaroid photos documenting every stage of mutilation. On the night of July 22, 1991, Dahmer met Tracy Edwards at a bar. He lured him home with promises of money. But this time, something went wrong. Edwards noticed the smell, the chains, the knives. He saw the Polaroids, and in a moment of bravery, he fought back. He punched Dahmer, fled the apartment, and flagged down police officers on the street. When police entered Dahmer's apartment, they could not believe what they found. Photographs of dismembered bodies, human remains in the refrigerator, a head in the freezer, a barrel of acid with bones inside. The nightmare was real, and it was worse than anything they had imagined. Jeffrey Dahmer was arrested on the spot. As the news broke, Milwaukee was shaken to its core. Families of the missing came forward. Neighbors who had ignored the smells and noises realized the monster had been living next door all along. Dahmer confessed in chilling detail. He admitted to killing 17 young men. He described not just murder, but necrophilia and cannibalism. He wanted to possess his victims completely, to make them part of him forever. The city was horrified. The nation was transfixed. And soon, the courtroom would become the stage for one of the most disturbing trials in American history. But in that courtroom, the question was not whether Jeffrey Dahmer was guilty. He had already confessed. The real question was this: was Jeffrey Dahmer insane? Or was he fully aware of what he was doing? That question would divide experts, families, and the public. And when the verdict came, it would shock the world. The crimes had been revealed. The monster was in chains. But in the trial of Jeffrey Dahmer, the real battle was just beginning. Not over guilt, but over his mind. Was this man insane? Or something even more terrifying, completely sane? The arrest of Jeffrey Dahmer left no doubt about his guilt. The evidence inside his apartment was overwhelming, and his own confessions left nothing hidden. But as the trial approached, another question rose above all others. Was Jeffrey Dahmer insane? In January 1992, Dahmer stood before a Milwaukee jury charged with 15 counts of murder. His defense admitted the killings but argued that his compulsions, his fantasies, his uncontrollable urges meant he was legally insane. His lawyers painted a picture of a man who could not stop himself, a man driven by forces beyond his control. The prosecution told a different story. They described a man who lured victims with promises of money, who carefully drugged and strangled them, who photographed their corpses and concealed the evidence. This was not madness, they argued, but method. Dahmer knew exactly what he was doing. For 2 weeks, the courtroom became a theater of horror. Psychologists debated Dahmer's state of mind. Families of victims sat only feet away from the man who had stolen their sons and brothers. Jurors saw photographs too graphic to ever forget. And Dahmer sat mostly silent, his face unreadable. Finally, in February 1992, the jury reached its decision. Jeffrey Dahmer was not insane. He was sane, guilty, and responsible for every death. The judge sentenced him to 15 consecutive life terms, a punishment that meant he would never walk free again. In court, family members of the victims unleashed their rage and grief. Some screamed at Dahmer, others broke down in tears. One sister of a victim had to be restrained after rushing toward him in fury. The wounds were raw, and no sentence could heal them. Dahmer himself spoke only briefly. He accepted the blame, told the court he never wanted freedom, and apologized. But for many, his words meant nothing. The damage was too deep. Prison became his new world. At Columbia Correctional Institution in Wisconsin, Dahmer lived under heavy security. For a time, he was kept apart from other inmates. Later, he was allowed into the general population. Reports from guards and fellow prisoners described strange behavior. Dahmer would shape food into body parts, drizzle ketchup to look like blood, and joke about his crimes. Some saw it as mockery, others as his twisted way of coping. There was another side to his prison life too. He began reading the Bible. He met with ministers. In 1994, he was baptized in prison, declaring himself a born-again Christian. To some, it was a sign of repentance. To others, it was just another mask. But behind prison walls, Dahmer remained a target. Other inmates despised him. His notoriety, his crimes, his attitude, all made him a marked man. On November 28, 1994, Jeffrey Dahmer was assigned to cleaning duty with two other inmates, Jesse Anderson and Christopher Scarver. Guards left them unsupervised. Within 20 minutes, it was over. Scarver attacked Dahmer with a metal bar from the prison gym. When guards arrived, they found Dahmer bleeding on the floor. His skull was crushed. He was pronounced dead at age 34. Jesse Anderson, another inmate, was also beaten to death. Scarver later said that God had instructed him to kill Dahmer, that he could no longer stand his jokes about cannibalism. Whatever his reasons, the man who had taken 17 lives was himself killed behind bars, not by the state but by another prisoner. News of Dahmer's death spread quickly. Some families of victims felt a grim sense of relief. Others believed his end was too quick, too easy. For Milwaukee, it was the closing of a chapter that had haunted the city for years. But even in death, Dahmer's shadow lingered. His apartment building, the Oxford Apartments, was demolished in 1992, erased from the landscape. Yet his story could not be erased. Documentaries, books, and films kept returning to the crimes. People debated endlessly. Was Dahmer born evil, or shaped by loneliness and neglect? Was he a monster, or a man who chose monstrous acts? And deeper questions remained. How had police ignored neighbors' warnings about smells and screams? Why had officers returned a bleeding teenager, Conorak synthesomphone, to Dahmer's care, only for him to be killed hours later? How many lives might have been saved if the system had listened, if society had cared? The story of Jeffrey Dahmer is not just the story of a killer. It is the story of victims who were silenced, families who were broken, and a community forced to confront its failures. It is also the story of how America turns criminals into symbols of evil, of fear, of fascination. Dahmer's life ended violently in a prison bathroom, but the questions he left behind still echo today. Questions about justice, about sanity, about the thin line between human and monster. And in those questions lies the true horror, that sometimes the scariest thing about Jeffrey Dahmer is not how different he was from us, but how disturbingly familiar parts of his story feel. Jeffrey Dahmer's arrest in July 1991 shocked the world. His apartment revealed a nightmare. Human remains, photographs of mutilated victims, and a confession that detailed killings stretching back more than a decade. 6 months later, he stood trial in Wisconsin, not for one murder but for 15. On January 13, 1992, Dahmer pled guilty. He admitted the crimes, but the question remained. Was he insane? For 2 weeks, jurors listened to testimony about strangulation, necrophilia, and cannibalism. Psychologists debated whether Dahmer's compulsions robbed him of reason, or whether he knew exactly what he was doing. After 5 hours of deliberation, the jury decided Dahmer was sane. He was guilty of murder. On February 17, 1992, he was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms. In court, Dahmer himself said, "I take all the blame. This has never been a case of trying to get free. I never wanted freedom." His lawyer told reporters there would be no appeal. The case was closed, at least in Wisconsin. But what if Dahmer's trial had taken place in one of America's death penalty states? What if, instead of life in prison, he had faced execution? That question forms the heart of an alternative history. In Wisconsin, there was no death penalty. But in Illinois or Texas or Florida, Dahmer would have been a capital defendant. Everything would have changed. His lawyers would have fought every step, delaying trial for years. Pre-trial motions, constitutional challenges, appeals, each designed to slow the march toward the death chamber. A capital trial would have lasted months, not weeks. Jurors would have been forced to see hundreds of photographs, to hear detailed testimony about mutilation, bone fragments, bite marks. Families of the victims would have been cross-examined about their pain, their anger, even their forgiveness. In Wisconsin, their statements brought the trial to a close. In a death penalty state, those same words could have decided whether Dahmer lived or died. And the appeals would not have ended quickly. In America, a death sentence almost never means swift justice. Years, sometimes decades, pass before an execution. Families wait through reversals, retrials, and endless hearings. For some, the process is more torment than closure. This is the paradox of revenge in the courtroom. On the surface, people demand the death penalty as the ultimate punishment. But in practice, it is slow, bureaucratic, impersonal. A grieving parent's act of vengeance might be immediate, personal, passionate. The state's vengeance drags on in filings and hearings, draining meaning with every delay. So what would Dahmer's alternative history look like? Perhaps he would have died in an execution chamber, a decade or more after his arrest. Perhaps his sentence would have been overturned, reduced to life, sparking outrage and despair. Or perhaps, like so many others on death row, he would have remained in limbo forever, waiting for an execution that never came. Instead, Dahmer's real fate was different. In 1994, less than 3 years after sentencing, he was beaten to death by another inmate in a Wisconsin prison. A brutal end carried out not by the state, but by a fellow prisoner. An act of revenge, personal, immediate, and final. The story of Jeffrey Dahmer forces us to ask, what does justice really mean? Is it punishment? Is it revenge? Or is it something else entirely? And when the system promises closure, does it ever truly deliver?